Good afternoon, everyone. And it is my absolute pleasure to really warmly welcome you all to the Bonneveer Institute of Human Rights today on this very, very special occasion. My name is Başak Çalı. I'm a professor of international law here and head of research at the Bonneveer Institute. And I will be moderating the panel discussion this afternoon. So the panel discussion that we're having today is a very, very special one for all of us at the Bonneveer Institute of Human Rights. It's a special one. It's also a bit of an emotional one as well. And this panel is organized to mark the retirement of Professor Kate O'Regan as the inaugural director of the Bonneveer Institute, following her 9 years, almost a decade of tenure as the founding director of this institute. So Kate came to Oxford in 2016 to set up the Institute of Human Rights here, which formally opened its doors at this building and in Mansfield College in 2018 with a grand opening. And some of you may have noticed the marks of this opening where Kofi Annan was also present in the formal opening of the Institute then. And under the directorship of Kate, this institute flourished and it has become one of the leading human rights institutes in the UK, in Europe and globally over the last decade. So one of the key hallmarks of this institute under Kate's leadership was to hold important and timely discussions, public debates around and about human rights, how we protect and promote human rights in a constantly changing economic, political and societal world. And a key focus of a lot of these debates also looked at how institutions do better, how they respond, how they become more agile and also more resilient in promoting and protecting human rights. And the role of universities as human rights promoters and protectors was one of the first events that was organized by the Bonneveer Institute of Human Rights back in 2018. So this is the spirit of this conversation that we're going to have today, because we're going back, maybe going forward, to that very important debate that Kate started back in 2018, to talk once again about the role of universities as spaces of knowledge production, as spaces of debate, but also as actors of human rights protection and promotion. And if you look at the world today, and if you looked at the world in 2018, I think the subject matter of this conversation could not be more timely or more pressing, even more so today. I'm not saying it was less important in 2018, but it seems to be that this is also an incredibly important moment to talk about universities, because universities are facing a significant amount of challenges all around the world, with no region being an exception to the challenges that we face in universities. So these challenges are not only about the right to academic freedom and how we uphold academic freedom, but they're also about key questions of how universities protect freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, equality, labor rights, and all sorts of other rights within universities. But there are also some very urgent and important questions about how universities may also not become complicit in human rights violations of crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, which is a debate that has also marked quite a lot of debates all around the world in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So today I'm joined by an outstanding panel of scholars, but most foremost leaders of universities. We have asked them to reflect on these pressing challenges based on their own experiences, foremost as not necessarily as scholars, as of course they're outstanding scholars, but also as leaders, people who have taken up some incredibly important leadership positions within universities in different parts of the world and also in different regions. So let me very briefly introduce my outstanding panel to you today in the order that they will speak. And of course, these introductions will do no justice to their achievements to date. So our first speaker is going to be Pratap Bhanu Mehta, and he's the Lawrence Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton University, and also Senior Fellow at the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. And he's also an Honorary Fellow of St. John's College in Oxford and a Fellow of the British Academy. He was previously Vice Chancellor of the Ashoka University and President of the Center for Policy Research. He's the author of very important books, for example, The Burden of Democracy, and also one of the co-editors of the Oxford Handbook of the Indian Constitution. We will then hear from Adam Habib, who is Vice Chancellor currently of SOAS University of London, and he's held this role since 2021. And he's also served as the Vice Chancellor and the Principal of the University of Wits in Johannesburg prior to this. He's a Professor of Political Science, and he has over 30 years of academic research and administration experience and expertise. And his scholarship has focused on democratization, social movements, inequality, with a focus, not exclusively, but with a focus on South Africa. Our third speaker will be Chris Stone, who is an Oxford professor. He's Professor of Practice of Public Integrity at the Blavatnik School of Government here at Oxford. And he's also a member of the Advisory Council of the Bonavero Institute of Human Rights. Chris served as president of the Open Society Foundation between 2012 and 2017, and also held leadership positions at Harvard University and the Vera Institute of Justice. His scholarship primarily focuses on criminal justice reform, and he also held very wide-ranging advisory roles and worked with governments across the world, including the Crown Prosecution Service of England and Wales. And our final speaker is going to be Eva Brems. Eva is a professor of human rights law at the Ghent University in Belgium, and where she founded the highly acclaimed Human Rights Center of Ghent University. She's been active as a chair or a board of several human rights organizations in Belgium, and she was also a member of parliament in Belgium between 2010 and 2014. And she is currently on the board of the Belgian's Federal Institute for Protection and Promotion of Human Rights. She's also an important participant as the co-developer of a human rights policy which applies to partnerships of Ghent University with other universities around the world, which also has led to many similar policies to be developed both in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in other jurisdictions in Europe. So we've asked our panelists to speak about 10 minutes. We will work on this collectively, and I also seek your help from time to time. I will do my best to stick to the 10 minutes because they will be sharing a huge wealth of experience and knowledge with us. What we thought after these interventions is to immediately turn to you for your questions and comments. And based on hopefully one, maybe two rounds of those questions, the panel will be able to come back and respond to some of the questions or respond to one another. After this, we're going to give the final word, the closing word of this event to Kate. And Kate is going to do a closing of this event. And I'm very excited about this closing because we also imagine that Kate's final closing of this event, we hope, will also be the start of new conversations about what she will be doing with the Bonavera Institute, with universities, and with lots of other work and scholarship that I'm sure is going to follow. So it's a final word to start some new conversations is what I think how Kate has also imagined the closing of this event. So with all of that, I'm going to go on to sit in my seat, and we will start the panel. Thank you so much again for joining us today. It shall be a promising and a very important conversation once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a great. Can you hear? Is the sorry? Great privilege to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking Kate for your jurisprudence, your leadership, and your personal generosity over the years. So across the world, universities are feeling beleaguered. Perhaps universities are always beleaguered. But the scale of challenges that they face in our time seem unprecedented. There are far-reaching changes in the economy, modes of knowledge production, methods of inquiry. And they're raising very conventional kinds of questions about universities, which is universities, for good or for ill, are historically, institutionally, some of the most conservative institutions in the world. That's both their strength and weakness. And a question every society is asking in light of these far-reaching changes. Can these very institutionally conservative institutions be made fit for purpose for the 20th century? And that's sort of one kind of, I think, debate. We are also in a very highly mediatized environment where what used to be local and trivial pathologies of academic life, gatekeeping, patronage systems, disciplinary boundaries, have gotten elevated into events of significant world historical proportions, on which millions of Twitter followers in some senses intervene and make it difficult in some senses to negotiate. The late Ernest Gellner used to joke that the only way to get progress in the social sciences was to treat academics like tribes and tribes like academics. Unfortunately, these days, if we air our afflictions in public, as I said, they get inserted in streams of conversation we cannot control. This might seem like a flippant point, but I think it raises a profound question that at least has begun to hit me more recently when we talk about universities, at least in India and America, which is a profound crisis of representation. What do I mean by that? I don't mean by representation the conventional meaning of representation, which is, are universities inclusive or exclusive? That's certainly a very important question in relation to universities, how socially inclusive they are, how much do they reproduce the power structures of society, or how much they resist it. But I mean representation in a more elemental sense, which is, I think we are at a moment, I think in global history in some ways, where the abilities of societies to represent their own workings to themselves is actually becoming much more difficult. Our ability to represent societies as objects of knowledge we fully understand is actually becoming more difficult, despite the fact that there is a proliferation of information, or maybe because of that. And I think universities are in part, I think, victims of that phenomenon. I'm constantly struck by the fact that I think in most universities, the actual practice of pedagogy, teaching, research, scholarship does not conform to the caricatures either of the left or of the right. And yet it is becoming so difficult to actually represent to people outside of the universities how universities actually function and what is it that they actually do in some ways. And I think this crisis of representation, where the university as an object of knowledge and how we actually represent it to the world, the gap between what we think we are doing and what the outside world thinks we are doing, I think is a significant challenge in some senses for us. But you might say, look, these challenges have been around for a while. But what makes this moment particularly fraught, of course, is the unprecedented scale of the political assault on universities. And certainly in two of the world's most important democracies, India and the US, I'm dividing time between both, so I'll speak a little bit about both in the next 7 or 10 minutes. And I think it's worth beginning by emphasizing the scale and ferocity of this assault. I don't think we have actually woken up to how systematic and scary that this assault is. It's on all fronts: financial, legal, ideological, extends to curricula. There's a lot of public discussion about the assault on elite universities in India and in the United States. But frankly, the restrictions and constrictions on non-elite universities, state universities in the United States, are actually far more wide-ranging. And one of the questions we need to ask is, why isn't there a kind of solidarity across these different kinds of institutions? Non-elite institutions are actually suffering as much, or perhaps even greater, I think, burden of this political assault than elite institutions. The collapse, in some senses, of what we used to think of as the two bedrocks of university life, which is institutional autonomy, rightly understood with some degree of accountability, and academic freedom, is actually quite spectacular in both of these democracies. And this collapse, of course, is happening against the backdrop of deepening political authoritarianism. Right? And universities are being swept up in this rising tide of authoritarianism. But I think the political significance of this authoritarianism has to be, I think, acknowledged in ways that perhaps we have not done so. And I have two things in mind. One, I think it is important to notice both in India and the United States that in some senses there is no opposition to the assault on these universities. There are technical legal cases you can, but there is no political opposition. It's not that the Democrats are rushing to the defense of universities. In India, it's not that the Congress party is running to the defense of universities. I think this is a point Greg Conti has made very powerfully in a recent essay. And it is worth us asking, what is it about this conjuncture that it is that assault on universities is not considered a deal breaker for any political party or any political movement? So I think in that sense we are in uncharted waters. It's not just authoritarianism of the right. I think in a sense the center and left don't think of this as a deal breaker. But the second reason I think this broader authoritarianism is, I think, important is there is going to be a lot of discussion, as there should be, about what is the correct institutional architecture of a university. Do endowments make a university independent, or do they make it more vulnerable? Are donor-driven universities more independent, or are public universities more independent? And I think these are important discussions to have. But one of the most sobering features of the last 2 or 3 years is that no matter what the institutional form of the university, donor-driven, alumni-driven, private Section 24 company, public university, every single one of these institutional forms has actually come under attack by the state, and the institutional design of the university is radically under-determining how much protection it has. And I think it's important to emphasize this because the future of the university, in a sense, will depend on how ruthless our states want to be in prosecuting them. Donors can also have an effect on university, largely if they think that the state is on their side. Or donors who fail to protect the university, even though they want to, their risk calculation changes if a state is ruthless. If a state is willing to say, we are going to throw out 5,000 of your foreign students in the next 6 months, right? It won't matter whether you're a donor-driven university or a private university or an alumni-driven university. And I think we are at a point in both of these democracies where too much hope in redesigning the institutional configuration of universities is not going to give you the kind of political protection against the whole-scale authoritarianism that in some senses we are seeing. Now, I want to make two very quick sort of historical political points about this conjuncture and end with that. The shadow of populism and authoritarianism, one would say, has almost always haunted universities. In the 1920s, the populist movement in the United States wanted to make the universities more inclusive, allow for forms of knowledge excluded by the traditional university system into the university system. But the 1960s was in some ways a very pivotal time, I think, for universities both in India and the United States, and I suspect in Europe, in part because of the social movements of the 1960s. Because in the 1960s, this idea gained ground, at least in some thinking progressive circles about universities, that the universities were not just for the production of knowledge or education, but they were a kind of intellectual vanguard for society, in some senses pushing universities into some imagined future, right? And I think a lot of the residue of those movements in the 1960s, in fact, almost all the reaction against universities, you can actually trace back to many of the student movements, the reaction against the movements of the 60s. Trump's language actually echoes Reagan in some senses in the 1960s and 70s. But what happened post 1960s, in a sense, was I think three things that allowed for at least a kind of modus vivendi where the universities could again regain a degree of independence. The first was a very counterintuitive thought. For those of us who are old enough to remember, 20, 30 years ago, discussions about universities used to invoke titles like tenured radicals, right? You remember that book by Roger Kimball? And one of the claims was that actually the universe, let all the leftists and those who think of themselves as vanguardists of society, let them all be placed in universities. They will make radicalism safe for society, right? University is supposed to be full of crazy people, right? You tenure people, they will become less radical. As Montesquieu said, if you give people more security, they also become more timid, right? So there was actually a dialectical understanding on the right and the center that you put up with the so-called craziness of the university. Let the Leninists be in charge of the university. And the university will be fine and society will be fine, right? Now, what's broken down at this historical moment is, in a sense, that understanding. And I just want to dwell on it for a second, why that has happened. So that social compact actually worked quite well, right? All the critics of capitalism were in the universities, but capitalism could chug along merrily. Nobody was, in some senses, calling for the abolition of capitalism, right? But that's an argument that actually doesn't work well in the realm of culture. Because in the realm of culture, the universities, in a sense, are more effective and corrosive, right, in some ways. And if you think of why woke politics matters much more than class politics does, I think the answer lies in some senses that fact. I think this is a fact the right has grasped about universities, right? Combine it with the fact that the gross enrollment ratios in most societies are now heading to 30-40%. Universities are now occupying this odd space between both elite spaces and mass politics, where the political stakes in capturing them are much, much higher. And I think this is the challenge we are going to face. Last, I think, conjuncture is this. Universities have always had a very complicated relationship with nationalism. They were, in some senses, their historical purposes was tied to the creation of national cultures, right? They have benefited from nationalism. They have benefited from, in a sense, the war economies that nationalism have unleashed. And I think the transition in almost all our societies to thinking of universities as cosmopolitan, not national spaces. Princeton changed its motto, right? In service of humanity. It was added to in service of the nation, right? I think that has actually created the conditions where there's a broader drift to nationalism, that all of these societies are asking the question, if universities are not going to be the conduit of nationalism and not contribute to creating a national culture, what are they for? It's not an accident that the main bone of authoritarian contention against universities is around the representation of history in universities. 1619 versus 1776 in the United States, medieval India, debates over medieval India, right? And I think historically one can take it for granted that whenever nationalism arises with the kind of ferocity that it is arising, universities will find it difficult to withstand, I think, that assault. So the sobering, dark ages upon us kind of story is the unprecedented combination of authoritarianism and nationalism that we are witnessing in both advanced democracies in the world is, I think, going to put a different kind of pressure on how we think of defending universities. And the usual business of institutional tinkering is not going to be enough. Thank you.
Let me turn to you, Adam. Yes, let's carry on.
So let me start by saying what an honor it is to be at this panel. I come from South Africa, and Kate's an iconic figure in South Africa, in both academic and legal circles. So it's a real honor for me to be able to speak at her retirement gig, if you like. So thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to share my thoughts. The second thing is I'm going to take a slightly different tack to Pratap, because in many senses, Pratap's taken a macro picture, systemic evaluation of universities and their location in the political economy in different historical moments. And I'm going to take a slightly different tack, because my thoughts are going to be influenced by my tenure as Vice Chancellor in two universities, one in Wits University in South Africa and the other in SOAS, and how, confronted with incredible social justice struggles, how I and the team around me navigated this out, and I think with some level of success. And then I will come back perhaps in the discussion to reflect back, because I think if we are asking the question about how do you defend universities, the South African experience may be a completely distinctive one from the Indian and from the American one. And I'd like to come back to that in the conversation. Let me start by the South African story. The South African story is I became Vice Chancellor in about 2013. I came in there, and about 2 years after that, I confronted the biggest social struggle by students in the post-apartheid moment. All 27 universities, students came out, and they largely came out in favor of free education. And I was, and the team around me were in quite a existential moment, because on the one hand, we supported the demand for free higher education. We did see it as a public good, and we saw the legitimacy of that social struggle. And so we responded to the South African struggle in two distinctive ways. When it first blew up, we were supportive of it. And I said publicly that I'm very supportive of the struggle, and I share the social objectives of the social justice struggle. But I said I will not make the fee increase go away. And I said I won't make the fee increase go away, because if you're going to resolve and address the challenge of financing education, it is a fundamental challenge of the policy architecture, not of trying to address it at a single institution. And if you try to address it at a single institution, you'll implode the institution itself. And I said, if this is going to be addressed and resolved, then it has to be at the state. And I'm happy to sit down, and one entire evening on national television, I sat, and it was filmed live, where I said, I'll sit with you, but I will not give up, even though I share your social justice goal. But I will march with you to the National Parliament and the union buildings to demand that we think about the policy architecture and changing the policy architecture. That's the first element. The second element is I called the police. And I called the police at a moment when universities, when that movement turned violent. And there were something like 10 buildings burnt, and about 2 billion worth of infrastructure torched in universities. And nothing had happened, but when that threat emerged at Wits, I brought in the police. And I said, no infrastructure shall be burnt here. You cannot hold that you're struggling for free education and yet threaten the universities itself and their infrastructure and those who want to continue to teach. And if you like, that got me into serious trouble with student activists. It got me into huge trouble with left-leaning academics, and it got me into serious trouble with certain political parties and even unions. And I wrote a book on this called Rebels and Rage, and that there's an entire chapter dedicated to the ethics of progressive political struggle. And so that's, if you like, evolved my first set of thinking. The second is I thought I'd come to SOAS and have a less eventful time, and had an even more eventful time at SOAS. Partly because I came in a moment where the UK, the stable polity, had become as chaotic as South Africa has ever been. And so when I came in, perhaps the single biggest struggle, social movement struggle that confronted us was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the attack on Gaza. And here too, the team and I took two separate elements in our response. The first response was quite distinctive from most of the universities. Most universities in the UK and the US invoked institutional neutrality. We rejected it. And I remember arguing a year and a half here, not very far away, at an Oxford debate, why universities cannot be institutionally neutral. You can't say you're committed to human rights. You can't say we're committed to inclusion. You can't say we're committed to social values and then say you're institutionally neutral on the biggest policy questions of our time. You don't have to move from there to comment on every political activity. That's not what we're arguing. But it does not mean you can be institutionally neutral. And I argued that the experience of the post-war Western university experience was not one of neutrality, but of plurality. But every time it got politically inconvenient, Western universities retreated into neutrality. The Chicago Principles in 1967 in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. The debate now in the middle of the Gaza movement. It always, when it got complicated, they retreated to neutrality. But the experience is one of plurality, not neutrality. So that's the first element. The second element, we said, is if we're going to be implementing plurality, then the rules have to apply equally to all. You have to apply the rules, whether you're on the left or right. You cannot have a different set of rules for people you agree with and for people you don't agree with. It is your conduct that will determine who you are, not your rhetoric. And what we will make sure is that we will act equally on all issues. And so when the Palestinian encampments happened, we said, I wrote a piece to the entire university community saying, let me tell you a conflict and a debate between Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael on what are the parameters of peaceful protest. And we defined that into 4 rules at the university. No disruptions of our exams, no disruptions, no destruction of our infrastructure, no attacking of an individual on our campus, no personalization against an individual. And if you like, you can't put a mask and walk into our buildings because people were feeling threatened, etc. And until that was existed, we didn't interfere with the encampment. But when people started being attacked personally, individuals, students, staff, myself included, started being attacked, physically targeted on social media, being followed in mosques and in the supermarkets and things like that, that's when we did act. And we then said there is proportional engagement. We will not immediately react, but first you got a warning, then you got a speaking to, then you got a suspension, and ultimately we actually expelled 3 people. And that put us into conflict with a lot of left-wing leaning politicians, lots of social activists, and an enormous amount. But actually, in the last year, we've had the quietest year in 7 years. Now, there's 3 fundamental lessons for leadership that come out, and I'll be very quick on this. Leadership number 1, lesson number 1 for leadership. If you're running a public university or a public institution, you can't sacrifice your institutional mission for short-term political gain, or because it's politically convenient for one time or the other. Your mission has to be your North Star. It is always in your mind. It is always what you focus back on. And if you have to make concessions, the mission itself can never be truly compromised. And that's the first principle. The second principle in leading a public institution is live with trade-offs. Because actually, it's not going to be about good or bad. You're going to have in every single decision 2 goods, but what can you manage? So in the university context, the things that I've had to confront both in WITS and in SOAS was how do you deal and get the balance between empathy for students, knowing they're young, knowing they need to learn, knowing they'll make mistakes, but creating accountability so it's a safe space for ideas and for all within the community. And then second, how do you manage the principle of financial sustainability and yet protect what is the core business of the university, which is its teaching, its research, and its public engagement? And on both those questions, you have to do that in standing up to politicians, internal stakeholders like unions, students, and particularly donors in this moment. And the third lesson for leadership is something that comes from Mandela. And everybody, in a sense, speaks about Mandela. But I'm astonished at how few have truly understood the message of Mandela's engagement. Mandela's activity in South Africa, the breakthrough that happens in South Africa as a result of Mandela, is if you want to fundamentally transform society, and I would hold an institution, you need to be able to talk to the opposite side and to peel off supporters from the opposite side so that the project you articulate is not a mutually exclusive one. And the day we broke the South African logic, the logjam, was when white South Africans realized, or at least a portion of them, that they had a future in a democratic South Africa as much as black South Africans is. And that message has been lost by progressive activists in the West. And look at social media. The research will show you that 70% of attacks by activists on social media are against liberals and not the far right. And that is what the research on social media shows. And so there's a real serious question to be starting to ask, have we lost what is our understanding of how to conduct progressive struggle and how to fundamentally transform society itself? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. Thank you.
Wow. So let me just say first, it's such a privilege to be part of this celebration, Kate, of your leadership and the culture you've built at this institute. I hope there'll be more to be said about that, but it's an extraordinary achievement that we're all the beneficiaries of. I'm not. I don't have the leadership background that my colleagues on the panel have. And I've spent some time. I was on the board of the Central European University during the height of its struggles with Viktor Orban, and have spent a fair amount of time when I was at the Open Society Foundations thinking about how to fund and support universities around the world. But I've been asked by Kate to bring an American perspective to the conversation, so I'm going to go all out on American exceptionalism here. So it's been a long time since Wally Sterling, who was president of Stanford University, described decades ago the job of a university president, not on the battles we've been hearing here, but he said the job of a university president: find the best possible faculty, upgrade the breadth and variety of students, provide the needed physical plant, and then sit back and see what happens. So the job today in the US is a little more complicated than that. But most important, there is absolutely no sitting back. It is so. What I want to do is see if I can persuade you in the next 10 minutes to put your hat in the ring to lead a major American university today. Because I think if nobody here is willing to do that, then what are we talking about? So imagine I'm on the search committee of let's call it Ivy University, and we've just lost our president. George Lackluster has just been forced out, resigned from the presidency under pressure from the White House and a few people in Congress, and so we're searching for a new president, and you're the solution. I need you to put your hat on the ring. I need you to do it enthusiastically, and here's why. So I want you to think about three Reasons. So the first is I have good news about governance. The board of Ivy University has had a very difficult set of inward-facing conversations. They've been on a long retreat. They've looked in the mirror, and they realized they are the problem, that they were more at fault for the trouble of Ivy University than the president, more at fault than the faculty and students who were so active over the last couple of years, more at fault even than the Trump administration. Maybe they bear some immediate responsibility, but the board really has been the problem. They looked in the mirror and they realized they are the problem, and they are determined to solve it. They looked around the room and they realized there were 21 people on the board. Only 2 of them had doctorates, and neither of them had ever worked in higher education. One used their doctorate to find a biomedical research startup, and another one is working on semiconductors. They're both in industry. Every one of the 21 people on the board is a donor, most of them in the millions. None of them have ever grappled with problems of academic freedom. None of them have ever dealt with the problems of student discipline. And they realized that leading the university with that board was part of what weakened their institution, that they didn't understand the job when they hired Lackluster, and they made mistakes by keeping to add more donors and more donors until they filled every board seat. So they've made a resolution. They want a board of only no more than 1/3 donors, and it has at least 1/3 people who have served in leadership positions in higher education. And there are some candidates right here I think we could get on. And they're willing to work with you, and they also have resources, they have networks that are useful to you, and they're not walking away. They will be happy. Every one of them said they'd be happy if you asked to sit on a non-governing advisory board and continue to support the university and your work. But if you want them to stay on the board, they're happy to continue to do that. So you've got to say yes, right? You've got to, when are you going to get an opportunity to reset the governance of American university higher education in a way that has balance, understanding the financial needs, the cultural, the educational principles, the higher education principles that need to be defended, and to work with you in that way. So it's hard to see how you could pass that up. So first point, governance. Second point, federal funding. Even apart from the governance problems, as we've been hearing, national funding for universities everywhere is an issue, but in the US it has a special quality. There are the state universities that we've been hearing about that have their own relationship with state funding. But let me focus on Ivy for a moment. Ivy gets 15% of its money from the federal government from research grants. That's exactly the same as Yale, It's about twice what Chicago has at about 7%. It's a little more than Harvard at 11 to 12% of their revenue from the federal government. And it's substantially less than Princeton, which gets 24% of its revenue from the federal government. And it's interesting that there's such a spread, right? That even among that tier of universities, you go from 7 to 24%, but they're all huge. You may remember some of the debates in American higher education about the distorting effect of sports, athletics programs on university governance and on university decision making, worrying about universities that get so much of their revenue from their athletic programs that it would change their decision making. Well, that's nothing compared to the numbers I just gave you. The highest percentage in America is the University of Alabama, which gets between 7 and 8% of its money from athletics, but it's much more typical, even at the big sports schools like UCLA and University of Michigan, it's 1 to 2% of the revenue comes. So if 1 to 2% is worrying people about decision making, 15% should really cause alarms. And part of it is we were asleep a little bit for a number of reasons. One of them is we didn't understand the federal government was a single donor. They didn't act that way as a single donor until a couple of years ago, or about a year ago. But today it's clear it is acting as a single donor, and so this is a huge threat. Now, you may have seen Jeannie Suk-Gerson at Harvard, the professor at Harvard Law School, has written a proposal that universities like Ivy should be willing to give up the federal money. That she suggests spinning off the hospitals, the big science labs, the heavily federally grant-dependent parts of the university. You can still cross-appoint some of those researchers as faculty to do teaching, but move the big federal grant money out of the universities, focus on the undergraduate mission, use the endowment for that, and take away this huge stick that the federal government has. And the board is going to want to know what you think of that proposal, trying to learn to do less as a university. But we on the search committee were pretty skeptical about that. We think universities gain a lot of strength by covering the whole spectrum, and we're not sure you could run a university with less than 1 or 2% federal funding today in grants. So I think we need a different kind of solution. And we've gone back and looked at what happened in the 1960s. Federal funding for American universities was negligible before the Second World War. Its rise is almost entirely in the last 70, 80 years, but its big boost way beyond just the GI Bill and tuition assistance comes in the 1960s. And in those acts, the 1963 and 1965 federal acts that supported higher education, which started moving huge amounts of money into universities for everything from infrastructure to student support, that money, the conservative Southern senators were worried that the Johnson and Kennedy administrations were going to use that to start interfering in hiring, curriculum, admissions. And so they wrote into the 63 and 65 legislation prohibitions on the federal government taking any opinion at all on those three things, on what's taught, who's hired, and who's admitted, to protect against the civil rights impulse. Later legislation didn't carry all that, and ironically, it's more the Clinton and Obama administrations that began to have views about who should be hired and what should be taught in universities, maybe views many of us in human rights would agree with, but this erosion of the protection. Universities didn't have to build that protection ourselves. We got a free ride from the conservative Southern senators in the US, and now we have to learn to build that ourselves. And so we want a president not who's going to go out and fight this battle as a solo, writing op-eds or giving speeches individually challenging the federal government, nor as someone who's just going to keep their head down and make private deals. We want you to join with other university presidents across the country to reestablish that firewall, reestablish those principles that the federal government honored for so long about what those limits are. It's going to be hard, but that's the direction we're looking for leadership. So again, how can you beat this job, right? You're gonna have a chance to establish the principle that will allow universities to continue to receive national funding while protecting academic freedom. The final point is simply about the practice of democracy, democratic practice. Again, in the United States is a special case here. Probably the single most influential document in university curriculum in the 20th century in the United States is the Harvard Report, 1945, General Education in a Free Society, which crystallized a movement happening right across state and national universities in the United States then about the role of universities in educating citizens for democracy. The switch from educating gentlemen scholars, and it wasn't all gentlemen, but gentlemen scholars to citizen scholars. That's changed in a couple of the last decade or two to sort of citizen leaders and democratic leaders. But the vision nonetheless was about equipping Americans for democratic engagement. And that is a political project. It can be the equivalent of the nationalism that we were hearing about. And indeed, the vision of democracy was a very American vision of democracy and American history and American principles. But the language wasn't about nationalism so much as it was about democratic engagement. And what do all citizens, and that's why that report, what do all citizens need? And that's why that report concerned both high school and college. That by then, the US in the 20th century went from about 5% of college age, we now think of as college age students being in college. It was about 25% when I was at university in the 1970s. It's a little over 50% today. And they understood that the universities were going to become more and more important in building democratic practice among its citizens, but they couldn't do it alone. So we want you to fight those battles, and we want you to articulate what you think today the role of a university is in shaping democratic practice among its undergraduate and other students. But you can't do that with any strength. You won't have any spine to hold you up in those battles if we don't get the governance and the funding right, and the board's prepared to work with you. So throw your hat in the ring, take on this challenge, rebuild American higher education with strong governance, principled funding, and a real articulated role in building democratic practice. And if it doesn't work out, find another way to get involved, because this isn't going to get solved if we don't each play a part. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So maybe we ask for some volunteers for this position. Is there anyone? Still thinking. So over to you, Eva.
Thank you, Başak. Well, first let me say what an immense honor it is to be a part of, I think, what we can call a celebration of the work Kate has been doing here at Oxford. I would like to talk a bit about the university as a human rights actor, or even a human rights defender. I think many of us here in the room are human rights defenders. I think I'm a human rights defender because of some of the things I do outside university, but also some of the things I do in university, in clinical legal education, for instance. And I think many colleagues at university are human rights defenders, and many students are. But can the university as an institution be a human rights defender? Should it be? So that's what I want to address. Now, universities, often through their highest representatives, sometimes publicly denounce human rights violations. Where I'm from, in Belgium, this typically takes the form of a public letter signed by some or all of the chancellors of the 5 Flemish universities, or even all 10 Belgian universities. Now, they do this more easily when the human rights violations take place in the academic sphere or concern academics. For example, in May 23, the 5 Flemish chancellors issued a statement denouncing the detention in Iran of Ahmadreza Jalali, a visiting professor at Brussels University, and in support of human rights defenders in Iran. And in May of this year, the 10 Belgian chancellors called on the Belgian government and on the European Commission to suspend the association agreement with Israel. Occasionally, the chancellors issue statements on human rights violations that are not related to academia, and of course they get a lot of criticism, but they do it. This happened, for example, in 2018 after Mauda Shouri, a 2-year-old Kurdish girl, was killed in a police chase in Brussels. All the Belgian chancellor asked the government to give her family legal residence status. And in their message, they also expressed their concern about the political rhetoric concerning migrants in our country. Still, one could say that this is not universities talking and taking position, it is the chancellors in their role of public intellectuals and opinion makers. Now, what we are seeing in the context of the campus protests about the genocide in Gaza is something different. Protesters are calling on the universities as such to take on responsibility for their impact on human rights violations ongoing in Gaza. This impact is, of course, indirect impact. In the US, protests focus mostly on universities' investments. And in Europe, the focus has also been on the collaborations of universities with Israeli partners, be they academic, government, or business. The idea behind this is that the university has blood on its hands, is morally complicit when it invests in or collaborates with organizations that are involved in serious human rights violations. They want the university, as you know, to boycott all engagement with Israeli organizations. These protesters could direct their action directly to the Israeli government, for example, by protesting at the Israeli embassy rather than on campus. Or they could also directly target the universities or companies that they want their universities to boycott. And some of them do that as well, yet they also carry on intensive campaigns addressing their university. So in my view, there can be several explanations for this. One could be the desire to focus action for change on a forum where one expects to more easily have an impact, one's own environment. Another is the wish to see one's work or school environment in line with one's fundamental values. Once you assess that your university is morally complicit in a genocide, you might feel that you yourself are complicit. Underlying is the idea that universities can and should be held accountable for their human rights impact on the outside world. This is an idea that I think is emerging quite strongly recently, although it is also being strongly contested. Now, from the perspective of human rights law, it's relatively new, but at the same time, it's in line with existing human rights law and mechanisms, in particular in the field of business and human rights. If human rights due diligence can be expected of corporations, it would seem that a fortiori it can be expected of universities, a fortiori because of the public function of universities. So the Gaza crisis has, of course, not been the first time that universities have been called upon to take up responsibility for human rights. At Ghent University, the issue came up on the agenda in 2015. This was in an advisory body on internationalization. The agenda item was the desirability of concluding a new cooperation agreement with an Israeli institution in a context in which a very large number of Ghent University academics were calling for an academic boycott of Israel. Now, the mood in the room was clearly against a boycott. But the argument was not one that said that the human rights record of that partner institution was irrelevant, but rather one that said we cannot single out one country. We have to be fair-handed in what we do, consistent. So in the end, they mandated the human rights person in the committee, that was me, to come up with a proposal for a systematic human rights screening of all international partners of Ghent University. After going through all the relevant procedures and university bodies, this policy entered into effect in the beginning of 2017. I worked on this with a colleague, Laurens Lavrijsen. We did not find any models in the academic world, so we modeled this mainly on business and human rights frameworks. This human rights policy has two key components, and the first is the insertion of a human rights clause in collaboration agreements that allows either partner to terminate the agreement in case the other partner is involved in serious human rights violations. The second is a human rights assessment of intended collaborations. Ghent University will not engage in any collaborative project if the project is likely to have a negative impact on human rights. That's not often the case. But in addition, and that's the most important part, Ghent University will not engage in collaboration with any partner that has a track record of serious human rights violations. This policy is implemented by a committee called Committee on Human Rights Policy and Dual Use Research, because they also do that. Now, the policy document that was adopted by our university board explains the motive for the adoption of a human rights policy with reference to the university's mission statement, as well as its social responsibility. Now, Ghent University self-identifies as a socially committed university. So it's argued in the document that this implies that it should attempt to optimize its positive impact on society and to reflect upon and minimize its negative impact. And it was argued that this not only applies to the societal impact in Belgium, but also much broader in the world at large. Now, there's also an argument in this document about the status of the university as a public actor. So by delivering higher education with a considerable public good component, Ghent University, it says, is embedded in the wider public sector and is expected to engage in promoting public service values. So as such, the human rights policy is seen as part of the university's broader social responsibility policy that also includes sustainability, fair trade, equality and diversity, and aspects of development cooperation. So in this context, the document finally states that it could be argued that under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, Ghent University as a public actor is not only under a duty to respect human rights, but also within its powers under a duty to protect human rights against violations by third parties, in particular in the context of international cooperation. So the document further argues that maybe more ambitious standards than human rights can sometimes be desirable, but at least it is an acceptable, a suitable minimal standard that can apply across the board in internal and external activities of the university. And because we are a pluralistic university, it's also very suitable as something neutral and universally acceptable. So that's what we started and have been applying at Ghent University since 2017. In 2019, a similar model was developed in VLIR, which is the umbrella organization of the 5 Flemish universities. So they all adopted this in 2019 and have been implementing it in different ways. To the best of my knowledge, these were the only universities that had such policies in place until very recently. The Gaza genocide and the related campus protests led many universities to think about these matters. Some decided to cut ties with Israeli partners as an ad hoc measure, just a one-time decision. Others decided the opposite. But then there's also a category of universities that felt that they should respond to the claim for taking up human rights responsibility, but that it could not be an ad hoc measure. So these universities started developing screening mechanisms for their partners. Now, for the purpose of a workshop that I'm organizing on this topic, I did a rather quick search, just some Googling and snowballing, and I found that screening policies have recently been adopted by the 3 Belgian French-speaking universities, 10 universities in the Netherlands, 2 in Ireland and 1 in Switzerland, and that proposals for similar systematic policies are on the table in at least 2 more Irish universities, 3 Spanish universities and 2 Italian ones. So that's nearly 30 universities we're talking about in total. It's not that many, but the overview is not exhaustive, but I think it clearly shows an emerging trend of universities taking up human rights responsibilities in their partnerships. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I am going to open the floor for questions. And it looks like we will be able to do 1 round of questions from the look of it. So I'm happy to collect about 3 or 4 questions and come back to the panel. I see 1 here immediately. Yes. Thank you. So we have 4 themes, and you're happy to pick and respond or reflect on equality and who is in the universities and who actually studies. Questions around freedom of expression at universities, source of funding, and the faculties and what their role is in all of this. So who would like to start us off with some reflections on 1 or 2 of these maybe matters? Maybe we go this way
Sure,
again.
okay.
Why not?
Thanks for great question. I think a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think your question about equality is absolutely spot on. And I think it now comes in 2 different forms, which reinforce it, right? One is the question that you raised, which is to what extent are universities, particularly elite universities, open, and do they actually facilitate social mobility? And a lot of the kind of backlash against universities is the loss of faith that that's what they do. In fact, they're actually reproducing existing, in some senses, in more insidious forms, actually. In fact, the nice thing about the old system, in some senses, was that everybody understood what it was, right? Now its self-presentation is at variance with what it is. But there's a second dimension that's been added onto it, right? Which actually comes ironically from the little success of these universities, which is the actual expansion of enrollment, where in a sense the 35 to 40 to now 50% that get into universities, in a sense actually have a different class status, and having a different class status with 50% as opposed to a small tiny elite that did whatever it did is in a sense different. And I think our politics is actually reflecting both those cleavages in some sense very, very profoundly. I think my one quick response to that is that, so there are things universities need to do, but my suspicion is that the question of equality is not going to be resolved at the level of the university itself, which is that if you actually have a society whose occupational structures are winner takes all and of growing inequality, right, where the stakes of not getting into a university are of a completely different order, right, than if you had a more egalitarian, I think the politics of it would be different. And I suspect that question, I don't think the universities can solve in a sense at that level. I have views on the other questions, but in the interest of time, I'll defer to others and maybe come back later.
Some ideas on funding, perhaps?
Well, I was going to pick up the local point because I think it's really great. And I mean, as we were, I think probably as all of us were preparing for this, you know, what is the subject? And the university today covers a hugely wider variety of institutions than certainly when I was in university, and certainly 50 years before that. And that's one of its strengths. And we didn't touch at all on that. Well, you touch a little bit, but it's enormous. And so I completely agree with you. I think in many ways, the most interesting and the most salient aspects of life at a university are more about the faculty, but in fact actually about the context, what's happening in each individual institution. They're really different. I think we were, when we were looking for the common, and I think, well, personally, I think this is why I decided to focus on leadership, because I think more than solving the funding problem or solving the curriculum problem or solving the politics problem, the actual task of running a successful university today depends on a vision that's rooted in that community, in that place, in that context, and it requires articulation today, because the phrase university alone doesn't do it. I don't think a whole faculty can provide that coherence. I think the coherence of the role of the university in a place with particular students, with particular histories, is actually the source of the creative power of the university. And so I really like the question. I wish we could have gone more into it.
Thank you. What would you like to pick up on?
Three quick provocations, and really it's provocations. First, on the last one, the common good. Universities have never been about the common good, historically. They have become part of the common good in the post-45 period, when we started taking seriously more and more sectors of the population coming into the university. But historically, it was an elite project. It was the aristocracy that got access to it, largely on the backs of the labor of everybody else. That's why it could be a free project. And the more and more people came into it, the more and more you had to look at finding a business model that made that possible. I can tell you this now, you can't think through the common good so long as your political economy is about overcharging international students and cross-subsidizing the 6th richest economy or the 7th richest economy in the world. The way British higher education is paid for is sucking resources from Malawi and China and India and cross-subsidizing middle-class students in the UK. That's not a project for political economy and for achieving the collective good at the local level. And it seems to me that debate has to be at the heart of the conversation. The second, which is a political conversation. If there is a fight back to be had to protect the university, it cannot be the political class fighting that fight back. Whether it's the Democrats, whether it's the Communist Party, whether it's the Social Democratic Party, because politicians do not see their primary understanding the historical mission of the university, which is to create and protect it as a place of pluralistic approaches to understanding big issues of our time. They'll redirect you to the political project. So the fight back has to come from within the university. And here's where I think the difference between South Africa and India and the US is. In South Africa, in Fees Must Fall, there was a fight back. And the fight back wasn't an individual fight back. The fight back was, sorry, we're not making this problem go away. This is a problem of the political class. We'll march with you to the government itself. That has not happened in India. As soon as the attack came, Indian universities and Indian faculty collapsed. And I find it astonishing how this empowered academics in the United States all folded overnight. Berkeley, this place which fought for free speech, handing over names of faculty because that is an abrogation of institutional mission at the worst level. And it seems to me, unless American academics and American executives find the courage to fight back themselves and stop looking at Obama to do it for you, this is a big trouble. And so that's the second thing I want to say. And then finally, I will raise the issue of sustainability. It seems to me you can't think about this wonderful, Chris put forward a wonderful, if you like, job description for the new vice chancellor or president of the university. But you can't do it with the existing cost structures of the American university. The faculties get paid a particular level. they get paid, they fancy buildings, because the whole thing is structured on $90,000 worth of fees. And if you want to understand the legitimacy crisis of universities in the Western world outside Europe, it is the fact that you making young people at 20 pay huge fees, and they start their professional lives with a 300,000 debt. That has never been a case in history where we've saddled young people with that kind of debt obligation. Until we fix that, you can't fix the problem of the legitimacy crisis of universities.
Well, I can pick up the free speech issue. It can refer to a lot of things. If you ask about free speech at university, this can refer to academic freedom of scholars. It can also refer to on-campus protests about issues in the wider world. But in all these scenarios, I think it is clear that free speech and the free exchange of ideas is the lifeblood of a university. I mean, it cannot exist without there being an environment where there is a free exchange of ideas. So universities should be very reluctant to restrict academic freedom within their communities, either by students or staff. And the whole society, I think, should stand up for academic freedom when it is threatened by the outside world, be it corporate interests or politicians or whatever. I think if you talk, I'm talking about this as a lawyer, as a scholar of law. I think there is actually some work that could be done to emphasize this more in the doctrine on free speech, that this is an area that is worthy of particular protection and where the room for interference is extremely limited. Personally, I think universities should also be very reluctant to call the police on their own students when they are protesting on campus or their staff. But this is partly just an application of the general idea of proportionality, and you do these things as a last step after other steps haven't worked out. So, I mean, this is your own community, so first you enter into a dialogue, obviously, and you try other means before calling the police and ending the action. But it's also part of your educational project. I mean, this is a place where these young people learn, they may learn physics and geography and whatnot, but they also learn democracy and they learn other things, and they may, this may be, if they participate in one of these long-standing protests, this may be one of their most formative experiences at university. So how you react in such a situation is extremely important, also from that angle of the primary mission of the university, I think.
Can I come back? I have to, sorry, I'll be a minute.
That was not against you, because you explained proportionality.
No. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, sorry, I just wanted to put one issue on the table. Is the threat to academic freedom doesn't only come out from outside. It comes from within the university. And let's be aware of that. That's the only point I want to say. There are enough cases in this country where it came from within the university and not only from the outside. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry.
Wow, thank you. And thank you so much also for your questions. So when we started, I said, I promised you that this will be a start of a conversation and definitely not the end of a conversation. And I think that our panelists really lived up to that expectation. So thank you so much for your interventions. And also, I'm sure this conversation will continue also during reception, which will happen. But now let me give the last word before we close the session to Kate.
Well, that's quite enough. That's quite enough. It's really lovely to see you all. And possibly for the last time, I'm going to give a very warm welcome to the Bonavera Institute. And for those who don't know me, I'm Kate O'Regan. So first, I just would like to start firstly to say that Bashak has overpromised what I'm going to do. But I want to start by saying a huge thank you to our panel members. I'd really hope that what we would get out of this panel is a sense of the deep complexity that exists in relation to universities across the globe. And I think just hearing the four of you talk, you realize how our own experience of what a university is deeply formed by where we first encounter universities, the societies in which we live. And sometimes I think we forget that when we move across boundaries and into different places, the experiences are different. And it's one of the great privileges I've had here at the Bonavera Institute is again and again to remind myself that my sense of what is common sense in the world, or is the obvious way that the world is not the way that the world is. And it's different in very different places. And I think, having had people from effectively 4 different continents talk about their experience of universities has illustrated that. And thinking about universities, I mean, gosh, I didn't ever think I'd get to this stage, but it's exactly 50 years ago since I first registered in a university. And that was at the University of Cape Town in 1975. And in the year that followed was the Soweto uprising. And effectively, for my entire sort of engagement with universities after that, which has gone through being a student, through being an academic member of staff, through being a member of a university council during the period that Adam was talking about. I was a member of the university council at the University of Cape Town. I've seen universities grapple with the project of being what should be a kind of beacon of hope in a society with the prospect of pursuing knowledge, enabling young people to get out in the world, with the reality of the difficulties of living in a complex society and all the injustices and how that reflects in a university. And it's left me with the sense that we so often come to these problems with an idea that universities are somehow living in a perfect world and we can expect them to be perfect. And I so agreed with Adam when he says at the end of the day, that's not the world we're living in. We're living in a much more complicated world. And I think that has been illustrated across the conversations today. And I think for leaders, this is really difficult. It requires courage because actually very often you have to do things with which people will disagree. And they're entitled to disagree, and they might even be right disagreeing. But the fact of that disagreement cannot possibly paralyze you, because what we really don't need in universities is paralysis. We need people to be able to take decisions, to function, to hold on to the mission, to make the university work, but knowing that we're doing it in a difficult and unequal society. And that actually goes for every society we're talking about today. We all live in deeply unequal societies. And so leadership is important. Leadership has to be courageous. And leadership will sometimes get things wrong. But what you really don't want is paralyzed leadership. We want leadership who can really try. And I suppose, at the end of the day, I'm partly having seen all of this, I feel much more sympathetic to leaders who are facing difficult decisions. And I'm much slower now to condemn them for things that perhaps I wouldn't have done, but because I can see how complicated it is and how important it is that they're actually there and taking steps. Now, mostly what I want to do this evening is just to say thank you to a lot of people. But I did want to start just a little bit, and in fact, I've left the piece of paper at my desk at the chair, but was just to tell those of you who don't know much about the Bonavera Institute what it does. And that is that we are a research centre here in the university, but we also have a very strong commitment to programs. And that is written into our core document. The idea that this is not just about doing excellent research, which is something that we are utterly committed to, but it is also about recognizing that in the world in which we live, we need to live this commitment to the idea of a world founded on human rights and the striving to build better societies. And so we do that in a whole wide range of ways. And we wouldn't have been able to do it without our generous donors, about whom I'll say something in a moment. But for those of you who are students, we run a summer placement program. Many of you, I know, I can see here, have been on it, where we partner with human rights organizations around the world, here in the UK and more broadly. And we're fortunate to be able to give students effectively a living wage stipend so that you can afford to go, whatever your family background is. And it is an opportunity really to expose our students to some of what we think are the most sort of impressive organizations working in human rights. So that's one of the things we do. We also run a global moot on media freedom called the Price Media Moot, which we've taken over from, had been running in Oxford before I arrived. And this moot runs in regions across the world, in South Asia, in Delhi, for a long time in Beijing, but now in the Philippines, in Asia Pacific, in Cairo, in the MENA region, in Johannesburg, in the African region, in Paris, for across Europe. For years, we had a round of the moot in Kiev, but unfortunately, that's no longer possible. And in North America. And it is an opportunity. It's not accidental, those regions we've chosen. It's an opportunity to talk about media freedom. Increasingly in societies, we're talking about media freedom would be dangerous if you weren't doing it connected to an Oxford moot. And we bring the finalists every year here to Oxford in April and have a range of both substantive and obviously competitive and fun events around the moot. And we have a very strong mooting community of people who have been through the moot. We have some of them here today who've been judges in the moot for many, many years. It is a way of trying to build a conversation and an understanding of the complexities of media freedom and free speech. And of course, gosh, the world is so full of interesting problems to set as moots in the digital world we live in. And then we run prison clinics particularly for people who have been convicted and who are not British nationals and are therefore facing deportation. We do that in partnership with the Centre for Criminology and with Turpin and Miller. And students every year sign up for those clinics and are basically able to participate in giving advice to prisoners who face it. But the way the clinic is designed is cases are taken sometimes all the way up to the upper tribunal and indeed even to the Court of Appeal to defend the rights of people we find who actually do have rights to remain in the UK and not to be deported. This is becoming politically less popular, as you might have noticed. But it's a very important program for students. And we finally, there are many others, but finally the other one I would just want to mention because it's a new one is our International Human Rights Law Summer School. Again, something that's come to the Bonavera from the Department of Continuing Education, has a wonderful history and to the program. Our colleagues Naz Gane and Shreya Atre are responsible for it, and Naz has been involved with it for many, many years. We partner on it with George Washington University. This year, for the first time, we established a scholarship program, had a fantastic array of applicants, and brought three students, or three mid-career, effectively, professionals from the Global South to Oxford to participate in the summer school program. So I just wanted to give you some sort of sense of the work that we do here that is in addition to the research. I could say a lot about the research, but Bashak Chola is our head of research, and we work in a whole range of areas, including, we believe in human rights as something that is connected to democracy, the rule of law, and the recognition of an international legal system, so that we don't have a very narrow view of it. And we look at a whole range of topics across that. At the moment, we have ongoing projects on modern slavery, on the use of AI by employers and how we should be thinking about that in order to ensure fair labor practices and that workers are not damaged by the use of AI by employers. On climate change and litigation, we've just had a project that's finished. And we produce, related to this, a series of reports called the Bonavera Report Series. The most recent one, which Bashak authored together with Alice Donald and Victoria Adelman, one of our doctoral students, was on the misreporting effectively that occurs around the European Convention on Human Rights and immigration. And I do urge you to look at it. It's really alarming to see the extent of misreporting on immigration cases around the European Convention and how these are picked up and ratcheted from one piece of press to the next, often entirely based on entirely false information. And the damage that is doing, in fact, to the trust in the system, both of the legal system and the courts more generally, but also into the European Convention. So those of you who would like to learn more about us, there are floating around some little cards, which are our annual highlights, which have got a QR code on, which you can learn about it, learn about the work here. But also, please do register for our newsletter, which you can do on the front page of our website, just on the right-hand menu, because we'd love to see you here again and to keep you within the community. So I'd like to sort of finish off by saying quite a few thank yous. Really, it is wonderful to see so many people here who have been absolutely core to building this institution. Starting, of course, with the extraordinary team who conceived it, led by Baroness Helena Kennedy, who's sitting here in the front row, who is indefatigable and indomitable, and proved to be somebody you couldn't say no to, both, I think, for Yves Bonavero, who's sitting behind her with his sons, Philippe and Olivier, and also me, who has been such a wonderful support, but who had the vision and the energy and the drive and the leadership to bring it about. She was ably supported by the person sitting next to her, Helen Jones, who was the development director here at Mansfield at the time, and a whole range of other people at Mansfield. I want to remember in particular Alan Dodd, the former bursar here, who sadly is no longer with us, but who was a wonderful presence in, I think, both the times of conceiving of the Bonavero Institute, which was an enormous financial project for Mansfield, and was terrifying, I think, for many members of the governing body. And there was some comfort that everybody took in the fact that Alan was looking very closely at the numbers all the time and said, yes, this is possible, or no, this isn't. And of course, then I've mentioned the Bonavero family, Eve and Anne and their sons and daughters, and the AB Charitable Trust and its trustees, who believed in the project and have continued to believe and support the project in so many generous ways. I can't say how often I've said to people how really fortunate we are with our founding donors, both in terms of their generosity, but also their support, their guidance, their commitment to the Bonavero. A huge thank you, Eve, Philippe, Ollie, Anne, who isn't here. It's really, we've been very, very fortunate indeed. I'd also like to thank my Mansfield colleagues. I'm a member of governing body, at least until Tuesday. And really, this is a wonderful community for a human rights institute to be in. Mansfield, talking about Haley's question about equality, Mansfield as a college has committed to the idea that you can be a student in Oxford, no matter where you come from, and you can still be at the top of your game, at the top of the class. And Mansfield's achieved this over 20, 25 years of striving. And it is really wonderful to be part of this community, to see the brilliant young students who come in, many first-generation university goers, many from the poorest parts of the United Kingdom. And I think just fits our values to be here, and we feel very fortunate to have ended up here. And I know sometimes we can be a bit noisy and a bit loud, and we apologize for that. But we thank you for your hospitality and for making it our home. There also would like to thank the administrative team at Mansfield, Clem Bro here, who's the current bursar, Lynn Quiggin, the domestic bursar. I think we have given Lynn more headaches. I can't actually see her here, but we've given Lynn more headaches than we certainly should have, and probably than you've ever had. But we're so grateful to you, because Lynn is basically our point of contact at Mansfield for organizing events, dinners like you're going to be attending this evening, and so on. And thank you so much, Lynn. We're really grateful to you. Tess McCormack, who's the current development officer. Tony Berezny, who's probably not here, but who is manages everything, went from a leak in the roof to we don't know how to sort out this problem, and is just absolutely fantastic. Porters, Chris Davis and Tom and their teams over many years have put up with 1,000 requests. Where's the Bonavera Institute? And graciously and kindly supported us in so many ways. I also want to just say something about how wonderful it is to see so many generations of the Bonavera family or community here today. From our very first postdocs, Stefan and Michael, it's great to have you back. To more recent postdocs like Katya, who's actually been here was here for 6 years. I can't actually believe you're not going to be here this year, Katya. There she is sitting behind us. Maya Nizhna, Daniela Locke, who couldn't actually come at the last moment. Naomi Lott, sick, as I see, sitting somewhere. And Lisa Sin. These have been a wonderful array of young scholars who have taught us all so much and have had an enormous amount of fun as well along the way. I want to say a special thank you to Annelyn Mikus, who was the first head of programs. But all those programs I outlined, I think Annelyn and I worked on closely together in the first years. She left us more or less during COVID, so we could never say a proper thank you. And she really was an absolutely stalwart supporter. Couldn't have done it without you, Annelyn, so good to see you. Christos Kyprios, who followed Annelyn, I think is also here up at the back. Another amazingly stalwart supporter. And I'm really delighted to see you here, Christos. Thank you for everything you did in your many years here. These programs are not easy to run, let me tell you. And I want to introduce now our new head of programs, Eliza, who's standing there, partly so that all the people who are involved in the Bonavera in previous years now know this is the person to talk to about programs. And it's wonderful to have you here, Eliza. Eliza's been here since January and taken to the role incredibly well, and really looking forward to seeing how things go in the years ahead. I would also like to, at this stage, say, also just to say, many of my doctoral students and former master students are here. It's so lovely to see you. There's a wonderful Yiddish word, which is a good Irish girl I should use all the time, which is nachas, which is the idea that I take such pride in seeing what you've done. It's wonderful. I want finally just to introduce the new director. Rachel, I can't actually see where you are. There you are. So Rachel Murray is the new director. We're very fortunate. She's coming to us from the University of Bristol. I'm particularly delighted because Rachel is one of the world experts on the African human rights regional system, and which is something which is obviously very close to me. And I really want to just to say, Rachel, I really wish you well. I think we're very fortunate to have you. And I know that this team around you will be enormously supportive. And then just a final thank you to the administrative team. I don't know if any of them are still here, but everybody who's had anything to do with the Bonavera knows that it could not run and it would not be the place it is without Zoe Davis-Heaney. I met Zoe almost as soon as I came to Oxford. She'd been seconded to the Bonavera. I don't think she knew what she was letting herself in for. But, you know, the thing about Zoe is that she cares for the people around enormously. She is always kind. She is always professional. She has always taken extremely well my view of, Zoe, we must be able to do that even if the university says we can't. Most administrators would say, the university says we can't, we can't. But Zoe has accepted that actually we probably can. And together we have managed to get a whole lot of things done, which we were very firmly told at the outset there was no way we could do. Sarah Norman isn't here. Rosie, I don't know if you were still here, Rosie Stewart is our events coordinator, sitting at the back there. I have to say, Rosie, when you arrived, events suddenly seemed to just flow along in ways that seemed impossible. So it's been fantastic to work with you. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank actually the dean. John Armour is the current dean, and this is, you know, sort of an enormously difficult job. We've talked about the difficulties of university leadership, but John has been so supportive to the Bonavera Institute, which is is not the easiest, I would say, of the centres to deal with, because we do a lot of very different things. But you've been enormously supportive, John, and I think you really have fundamentally believe in the project that is going on here, and that has been very, very valuable to me, and I think is enormously valuable to the Bonavera. So thank you for that, for the way in which you manage the recruitment process and so on. It's really been a pleasure to work with you, and I'm very relieved that it was you who was leading it. So thank you. So that really brings me to the end. I just want to say finally that no institution is an institution unless it survives change. I really fundamentally believe this. I watched this at the Constitutional Court in South Africa. I've watched it at many universities and in many NGOs, because one of the things many people who know me well will know, I have sat on far too many boards and watched far too much transition in too many different sorts of institutions. And transition doesn't mean staying the same. Transition does mean change, and we should embrace that. And again, as many of you know, I'm a very keen gardener. And one of the things I have really learnt is that actually there's something fascinating about watching the way in which things organically change. And so just to say to all of you, I'm sure that the Institute will change, and that will be a good thing. And the fact that you've all been part of it up till now, I hope you'll all stay part of it. And I really relish seeing how it changes. Thank you.